In this video, we're going to talk about numeric data type in Python. Basically, we have three different numeric data type in Python: integer, float, and complex. Integer is a whole number, negative numbers, zeros, and positive numbers. Float is a floating point number, numbers with decimal. Complex is a data type with a real number and imaginary number. So if we say x and we assign an integer to this, we say 12, and I'm going to create y variable, and I'm going to assign the value, for example, 15.5. This is a floating point number, and if I create a variable named z and assign the value, for example, 3j, this is an imaginary number. This 3 is the real part, and this j represents the imaginary part of this complex number. So if I print this 3 variable, it will output in the terminal 12, 15.5, and 3j. But we want to know the type of these variables. If we want to know the type of a variable, we have a function named type. Inside this function, we can put the name of our variable, and it will show us the type of that variable. For example, if I put inside this type x, and I print this type, for example, I'm going to assign this function to a variable like t, and if I print this t, it will show the type of x. I'm going to say print, and inside that I'm going to say t. If I save it and run it, it will show that class int. The type of this x variable is integer, or I can put directly this type inside the print function. I'm going to delete this t and also this t inside the print function. I'm going to cut this type and we'll paste it inside this print function. Now if I save it, it will work also the same. There you go. It shows class int. The type of this x is integer. I'm going to copy this print function 3 times, and I'm going to change this x to y and the next x to z. So if I save it and run it, there you go. It printed the type of these 3 variables, x, y, and z. X is integer, y is floating point number, and z is a complex variable. But if I delete this type function, it will print the value of the variable. I'm going to delete these 2 print function, and also I'm going to delete this type. And let's copy this print function, paste it 3 times. Inside that, I'm going to say y and z. Let's save it, run it. There you go. It printed 12, 15.5, and 3j. I can assign a positive number to a variable like 12. This is also integer. Or I can assign 0. This is also integer. Or I can assign negative number, for example, negative 3. If I print them, it will print it 12, 0, and negative 3. And if I want to know the type of this y, inside this print function, I'm going to say type y. I want to save it, print it, there you go, 12, and the type of this y is integer. And also floating point number can have one number after decimal, for example 12.1, or it can have multiple number after decimal. For example, I'm going to say 15.126789. This is also a floating point number. Or we can have negative numbers with floating. I'm going to say negative 3.4578. So if I save it and run it, there you go. It printed 12.1, and it printed the type of this y, which is float. If I delete this type and say y, save it, and run it, there you go. It printed 15.126789 and negative 3.4578. And complex also can be negative or positive. For example, I can say 12 plus 4j. This is also a complex number. Or I'm going to delete this y. I can say, for example, here, negative 3j. This is also a floating point number. I'm going to delete this print function y, and I'm going to save it. Let's see, it printed 12 plus 4j. And also it printed negative 0, negative 3j. This is a complex number. Another interesting point about data type is type conversion. For example, the value of our x is 12, and this 12 is a integer number. For example, if I say here type, and inside that I'm going to say x, and I print the type of this x, as you can see, it's an integer number. I can change the type of this x into float. For example, I'm going to say z is equal to float, and inside this, I'm going to put the x. This is also a function, the float function, that changes other numeric data type into float. So if I say here instead of x, z, because we said this float function that converts x to floating point number, we assign it to z. If I print the type of z, it will show floating point. There you go. Class float. The type of this z is float. Or I can use directly this float function when I want to assign to a variable. For example, I'm going to delete this. Here, I'm going to say float function, and inside that, I'm going to say 12. If I print x here, it will show the floating point number. The type of this x will be float. As you can see, the value we assign to this x is an integer, but we convert this 12, this integer number, with float function, and it will show the type of this x a float. I want to save it, run it, it printed float. Or also we can change the complex number into float. Another function that is interesting, integer function. For example, we have a floating point number, we have 12.45, and we want to change the type of this float into integer. Here I'm going to say y is equal to int function, and inside that I'm going to put the x variable. If I print this x, it will show just the numbers before decimal point, and it will ignore the numbers after decimal number. Let's save it, print it. Oops, I printed the x. I should print the y, because here we change the type of this x into integer and assign it to y. I'm going to say here y, save it, run it. There you go, it printed 12. We can change an integer or complex number to float, or also complex number or floating point number into integer, but we cannot convert integer or floating point number into complex number. So this is the basic information about the numeric data type. See you next video, and bye for now.